Welcome back to another episode of the Island 54 Devlog. Did I really cheat a little in my inventory implementation? I've had basic inventory working before in my game. You could pick items up into your 2 hand slots and drop them back on the ground. I've since doubled down on the MMO aspects of my game, so need to admit to taking a little shortcut. I'll start out by describing the limitation in my current implementation and how I planned on addressing it. I'll tell you how I went about fixing it and the challenges I faced along the way. And lastly, I'll go over what my current goals are and talk a bit about the public playtest I'm planning on running soon. As always, there are timestamps in the description below. Before I get started, I have an exciting giveaway to announce. JetBrains, the makers of the IDEs I use, has very kindly provided me with 3 writer licenses to give away to my viewers. I want to make absolutely clear that this is not a sponsored segment. They've provided me with the licenses, but are not requiring or even requesting that I say anything about them. I want the licenses to go to developers who will make something great, so here's what you need to do if you want one. Head over to my much neglected subreddit, r/island54, in the next 2 weeks. Make a new post to show off whatever you're working on. Do you have some great screenshots? Make a gallery. Don't have screenshots? That's fine too. Just tell the community what you're doing. Not working on a game? Head on over anyway and have a look at what other creative minds are working on. Ask questions and upvote what you like. I'll choose what I consider to be the most 3 deserving entries and announce them in episode 23 of the devlog. See my post over on Reddit for full terms and conditions. It's not a secret that I'm a big fan of many of the JetBrains products. I use Rider for all my C# development and highly recommend it. Its refactoring and auto-completion is way ahead of VS Code. Its integration with Unity helps you manage backwards compatibility for mono behaviors and quickly navigate to usages of your classes within the game hierarchy. As I said, this is not a sponsored spot, but there is a 30-day free trial of Rider available, just enough time to get you through to our winners being announced. There's a link to the free trial in the description below. So how was it that I cheated with my inventory system? So far, the server has only been concerned with the positions of players and mobs. Less mobile items, like trees and rocks, have all been managed 100% locally. That means that when a player picks up or puts down a stone, no one else sees the stone move. And if you leave the game and come back in, the stone is right back where it started. There's just been no shared state or persistence. The first thing I was going to need to do to correct this was port what I call the scatter generation code over to the server. Then, whenever the player manipulates an item, I was going to need a way of sending an instruction to the server to do the actual pickup or drop of the item. I don't want to add the idea of a command to my protocol, so figured I could instead just use components. When the player picks up an item, it can locally show the item being picked up and add a remote command request component to the player entity indicating an operation has been requested. That component has a verb, pick up, and some parameters like the entity being picked up and the slot the player wants to pick it up into. When the server sees that component, it can try executing the command and update the component with the result. When the client sees the result come in, it can either delete the command component because it's not needed anymore, or undo the operation if it failed, maybe because someone picked up that rock just before you did. The same idea can be applied to pretty much any action the player might want to do. Dropping the stone again? Well, that's just a different verb with some slightly different parameters. Harvesting a tree? It's just the same thing again, but the server will generate a bunch of extra entities as a result. The design seemed pretty good to me, and nothing could possibly go wrong. So it was time to move on to the implementation. So I started out porting my scatter generation code across to the server. One of the requirements of my earlier scatter generation code was that it generated the same scatter, the same trees and stones, each time it generated a chunk, so that it didn't need to keep everything in memory all the time. But my server has entity persistence now, so that wasn't needed anymore. Once I generate the scatter for an area, I never need to generate it again. So I focused on porting across the random mode of the scatter generator. I put this code in my terrain service, since these scatter entities are sort of a property of the terrain and need to be generated whenever terrain is generated. About 100 lines of TypeScript later, and I had my port working. The scatter items are defined in YAML. For each item type, I can control the altitudes it generates at, the maximum number per chunk, and a relative probability of it occurring on any given tile. Just like the client-side implementation, it runs through each tile in the chunk using a basic in-place shuffle algorithm. For each tile, it considers which scatter items might be placed there and basically rolls a die to account for its probability of being on that tile. If there are still multiple candidates for that tile, then we randomly choose one and place it there. all the entities get pushed out to the entity server and have a private attribute applied to them so we can tell they were generated as scatter. The code can be tested by hitting the REST endpoints from the command line. With an empty database, we can see there are no entities. After fetching data for a chunk, then refetching entities, we can see lots of entities have been generated. As I said, the design is perfect and nothing could possibly go wrong. It was time to spin up the client, and nothing came through. It turns out the design was not in fact perfect, and something could in fact go wrong. The problem was that when a player came into the game, they needed all the entities near them to be sent through, and that is hundreds of entities now. The updates for those entities very quickly overflowed the 1500-ish byte limit on a UDP packet. Many developers suggest modifying the protocol to allow UDP packets to get broken up and rejoined at this point, but I want to avoid doing that if I possibly can. Any such changes will have an impact on latency. I always say, your UDP packets either die or live long enough to become TCP. So instead, decided to extend my protocol a little. What if instead of sending all those little updates through, we instead work out which entities we don't expect to change often, call them static entities, and bundle them up into some other slower, out-of-band channel? Things like trolls and players can keep getting their updates sent over UDP. Things like trees and stones can instead result in a message being sent to the client saying that a whole chunk worth of entities should be fetched over HTTP. I added this concept of a chunk invalidation to my protocol, then changed my implementation to only send real-time updates for dynamic entities. For all the static entities, I just reduce them down to a list of chunk coordinates and send invalidations for those chunks. Dynamic entities get bundled up into the UDP packet, so the client can see them as quickly as possible. And it worked first time-ish. If you want to see how changes like this actually happen, be sure to check out my streams. I do all my interesting development on stream these days. I'm 20% of the way to my goal of 50 followers on Twitch, so be sure to follow me there if that's your kind of thing. Even after a morning of bug fixing, I still hadn't fully implemented the algorithm, so the server still sends through either updates or chunk invalidations for every entity or chunk on every tick. That's going to be a problem for Future Martin though, because we're way into the episode and still haven't made any progress on the inventory. I changed the pickup handler in the client to add a remote command request component to the player, and made sure these components were being relayed to the server. That went suspiciously smoothly. I added a call into my ticker service, the server-side service responsible for running game logic, to find all the unhandled remote command request components. If the verb is pickup, then it calls out to the entity service to clear out the entity's location and instead set its parent entity ID and that entity slot. Drop was implemented in much the same way. I seem to have run into a lot more bugs implementing the drop handler, but got there in the end. So after all that work, what I have is a world that looks much like it did before I doubled down on making this an MMO. But this time, other players can see items being picked up and put down, and those changes persist. Next, I want to talk about my plans for my game. I need to start testing out some of the core mechanics of this game. Honestly, I regret going down the MMO path because I could have tested a bunch of these ideas so much faster without worrying about it. But now that I have the multiplayer aspect, I'm going to take advantage of it. So here's what I want to test first. I want players to go find a copse of trees. There will be trolls there. They'll need to clear out the trolls, then slowly harvest those trees. While harvesting the trees, trolls will randomly approach them. Then what I want to test second is having people pair up, where one is good at chopping trees and the other is good at chopping trolls. In order to run these tests, I need a few more things. I need to improve the netcode so that it's not sending updates for every entity or chunk on every tick. I need to have some concept of biome so that trees and trolls can spawn in copses. I also need to deploy my server out to the cloud. And lastly, I need to get testers to playtest my game. A lot of people have expressed an interest in helping me test, and I plan to have a lottery system for access, but I figured this is a good chance to promote my Patreon. For the next 2 weeks, all tiers will get priority access for playtesting. Want to avoid the lottery and support my game at the same time? Join me on Patreon for the price of about a coffee a month. Link is in the description below. Be sure to subscribe for more updates. If you want to see how I started on my MMO journey, check out this episode or binge the whole series to date with this playlist. And until next time, happy game developing.